they've been using very inventive ways to get around doing actual QE, but finding other ways to do basically monetary easing. And this is not even to mention, right, the TGA and reverse repo, which on Tuesday, right after the collapse in the Japanese stock market, reverse repo fell below 300 billion for the first time since 2021, since like April of 2021. So, they are able to use that as a liquidity source, but that was at 2.1 trillion in 2021. Now it's at 300 billion. It's soon going to be at zero if they continue at this rate. So, they're running out of options before their next cutting cycle. I think they know that QE is inevitable again.
Yeah. No, and the other mechanism they've been using is just over-indexing on bills over longer dated treasury bonds, which has had a stimulating effect in the economy. We're issuing shorter term debt. I'm not sure if you read that paper. Funnily enough, what's his name? Nouriel Roubini wrote a couple weeks ago, basically highlighting this, which is typically these auctions will be made up of 10 to 15% of short dated bills. But over the last 18 months, it's been something like 47% of the auctions have been these bills. And that has a QE-like effect on liquidity profile markets at any given point in time when you over-index on the short end of the curve.
It does. And it's also, this is what emerging markets do, right? Like emerging markets are the ones that do 80% funding on the front end and 20% on the back end. It's usually developed markets that have the inverse, that only have 20% funding on the short end on the bill side and 80% on the long end. And so this flip that the US is experiencing is endemic of an emerging markets crisis.
So you're saying the US is back to emerging market status?
Luke Gromen called it, obviously way before I noticed this. He calls it US with Argentine characteristics. And I think that's a really good way to phrase it.
So what, do you have a timeline? I know people don't like timing things, but how slowly or quickly do you think this can take to play out, especially taking into consideration the pivot from the Bank of Japan earlier this week?
Well, it depends on what you mean by play out, right? If we're talking about, an eventual move to a full-on emerging market where we're funding completely on the front end, obviously we're still a few years away from that, but the recent trends have not been, heartening. They haven't been encouraging. And so I would say, I've said this before, I think COVID was the real catalyst that brought this entire debt problem and the inflation problem up by 7 or 8 years. And that accelerated all these trends. And we're continuing to see an acceleration of these trends into the latter part of the 2020s. I think the U.S. debt crisis, it's already started and it's going to continue. And I think by 2025, late 2025 and early 2026, we're going to really start seeing the pressure for almost permanent QE begin for the Fed and essentially like maybe QE for the banks, like I said, SLR exemption for the banks starting in 2025, late 2025 or early 2026. Just because of the rate of path of the debt growth is accelerating to the point that you can't really absorb that by the private sector. And foreign privates are buying, but again, their buying has been weakened as we saw with this recent auction. They aren't swallowing as much of the debt, and we're having to fund more and more at the short term, at the front end of the curve. And it's not encouraging. It's not a good sign for a market as developed as the US. And remember, we're the only country with the global reserve currency. So we're the only one with large external buyers of our debt. Every other country has a small amount of foreign private investors, and that's basically it. The U.S. is the only one with, we have north of $7 trillion of treasuries held by foreign central banks. No other currency can claim that. And so with our own debt problem accelerating and foreign central banks slowing down their buying since 2015, like Luke Gromen has noted, I expect that this debt crisis will finally come home to roost and we'll just have to do yield curve control at some point. Again, I'm not thinking that until 2026, probably at the earliest, but it's coming down the pipeline for sure.
Hey, do you still have your Bitcoin on an exchange? Don't hold your Bitcoin on an exchange. Take it into self-custody. If you're looking for an easy way to do that, we have the BitKey. BitKey is Bitcoin made easy to use and hard to lose. Take the first step, get your Bitcoin off the exchange. Check out the link in the show notes. That'll get you 20% off your BitKey, or use the code TFTC20 at checkout.